A mother who lost her beloved son still hated me, calling me an old rat. She has every reason to hate me. It is human nature, but I prayed to the Lord. My Lord, please give your forgiveness and consolation where hatred exists, and give birth to your love. Please eliminate resentment and the hatred of hostility by your cross. Please pity your servants and favour bereaved families of Pearl Harbor with your grace. Please offer your salvation to them, making two things as one. Amen. People's prayers are heard. My prayer was heard as early as that night. It happened this way. Sachs and I crossed the strait to Bremerton Naval Port by ferry. Since it was a naval port, the city was full of Navy colours. The Youth for Christ Assembly was held in the Petty Officers' Mess, where the audience numbered over 300. The assembly was managed as usual, and I was seated on the stage after I finished my speech. A middle-aged woman advanced to the stage, leading her son, about 12 years old. She was holding his hand and greeted me. "Captain, this is my son. Will you please put your hand on his head and pray for my son?" Then she turned to the presenter to ask if she could talk to the audience and explain the reason why she wanted me to pray for her son. The presenter nodded his consent, and the woman spoke. The day that this captain bombarded Pearl Harbor was my expected delivery date, and I was checked in at a hospital in Honolulu. My husband was a Navy lieutenant and the chief gunnery officer of the USS Arizona. The mention of the name, USS Arizona, took my breath away. The woman continued. The previous day was Saturday, and my husband came to see me in the hospital. However, he returned to the ship that night, telling me that he would come back again the next morning. The next day, the 7th, Sunday, a few minutes past 8 o'clock in the morning, the glass in the windows in my hospital room trembled with a big shock, and that was the moment this boy was born. Later, I learned that it was the explosion from the USS Arizona, and at that moment my husband was gone forever. It touched my heart deeply. Just as the boy was born, his father disappeared. This memory was hard for me. I have hated the Japanese Air Force that bombed the USS Arizona. However, my husband was also a Christian. While hearing the testimony of Captain Fuchida, who was the commander of the attack, I could not stop shivering because of this miraculous deed of God. This child does not know his father. Later, when he was old enough to understand, he learned how his father died, and he has refused to believe in the Saviour Jesus Christ, however much I have tried to lead him. He has become obstinate because of that fact. Captain, please put your hand on his head and pray so that his soul will be saved. Everyone in the audience fell in breathless silence. I looked back at the audience, urging them to join me in prayer, and I passionately offered my prayer. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. There was a sequel to this story. Roughly 10 years later, during my third trip to the United States, I was attending assemblies in various towns in the countryside of the state of New York. At one particular assembly on a Sunday night, about 20 students from the U.S. Military Academy appeared. All of them looked sturdy with their square haircuts, wearing uniforms with pepper and salt patterns and velvet bordering. One of them, who appeared to be their leader, approached and talked to me. "Captain, do you remember me?" I was startled and looked at him over and over, but his face was not familiar. I said, "Sorry, I do not remember you. Who are you?" Then he answered, "It's quite understandable as it was 10 years ago. I am the boy for whom you prayed in Bremerton Naval Port." I was surprised again. I looked at him once more as he had grown up so much. It turned out that after the Pearl Harbor incident, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt came to hear the story of this boy's birth, and he promised that if he wanted to enroll at either the Military Academy or Naval Academy in the future, the President would sponsor his admission. The boy chose the Military Academy at West Point, his birthright based on the President's guarantee. Since that day when his mother asked me to pray for him, this boy grew up as a good Christian, supported by prayer. After entering the Military Academy, he organized a choir and conducted the choir himself. Hearing that there would be an assembly hosting Captain Fuchida in a nearby city, he came to help, and he led the choir. It was a fantastic chorus with a rich, natural voice. Stories of this event spread to many towns. Newspapers treated this article as a big event, and people adored the glory of Jesus Christ. I welcomed the new year of 1953 at the headquarters of the Sky Pilots in San Jose, California. On January 23rd, Friday, we departed from San Jose on a trip of testimony across the eastern part of America. On the 28th, Wednesday, we left Wichita and arrived in Kansas City via Topeka on the 29th. Sachs wanted to establish a strong Sky Pilots branch there, as it is located in the center of the United States. We stayed in Kansas City for 3 days. We spent February 1st, Sunday, at morning service at the Central Bible Church and at talks at the Japanese mission in the afternoon. As the name implies, this Japanese mission sent missionaries to Japan, including many single ladies. Sachs and I stayed at the home of a postman who was a Sky Pilots supporter. The postman had a sister who had been sent to Japan by the Japanese mission, and she happened to be back on home leave. She told us that ex-President Harry Truman's sister, who was a particularly close friend among her fellow missionaries, also happened to be back in Kansas City on leave. She suggested that I should take advantage of this connection and see ex-President Truman. Sachs was very positive. Where does former President Truman live now? He is retired in a quiet country town about 20 miles away from here. Is Mr. Truman a Christian? Of course. It went on like this, and finally Sachs and I were taken by the missionaries to visit President Truman. Truman was retired but seemed busy with many visitors as a major figure in the Democratic Party. Agents from the Secret Service for the ex-president kept a careful watch. Truman appeared. He looked very healthy. First, Sachs was introduced, and he introduced me in turn. As usual, Sachs started his lengthy introduction of Sky Pilots. I was rather worried because we were limited to a 15-minute interview. Truman was listening and nodding, but he seemed to have more interest in me. Tea was served by the missionaries, and the atmosphere was amiable. Before long, Truman talked to me. You see, Captain, I was a major in the army. Since you were a captain of the Navy, let us talk as soldiers today. With that, he signalled Sachs to put aside his story of Jesus Christ for a while. Then he mentioned Pearl Harbor. We talked about various incidents from those days, and President Truman, laughing, said, Captain, as far as Pearl Harbor is concerned, we were both guilty. Just as I was beginning to say, We may both be guilty before God, though, Truman interrupted, saying, No, not only before God, but before human beings, we will both be proven to be guilty as a fact of history. I also touched on the issue of the release of prisoners of war, telling him that I brought with me a list of written petitions. To this, he reassured me, Captain, don't worry. The issue of prisoners of war will be taken care of shortly. The atmosphere was cordial. We left Florida to head north and entered Washington, D.C. on February 21st. The following day was Washington's birthday. President Eisenhower is a Christian. According to the newspapers, on Washington's birthday, he visited a church in Virginia that had a connection with George Washington. Eisenhower, America's 34th president, had had his inauguration ceremony just 1 month earlier, on January 20th. I watched the ceremony on TV. The presidential inauguration ceremony was conducted solemnly and splendidly on the Capitol's east portico, witnessed by almost 500,000 people gathered in the square. President-elect Eisenhower took the oath of office, raising his right hand with his left hand placed on the same Bible used by President Washington for his inauguration oath. I was deeply moved watching it on TV. It was certainly a gesture that demonstrated reverence for God. I was further surprised by a newspaper report that Eisenhower was baptized in a Presbyterian church after he took the oath of office. The article said that this was simply because he had not received baptism earlier in life, but I wondered if he had not been a Christian before his baptism. But Eisenhower himself said that, To date, I have placed faith in God. I heard that Eisenhower always kept his Bible, with a red leather cover, by his side. There was no doubt that he regularly read the Bible, judging from the religious tone of his political speeches. At the time of the presidential election, when his supporters advised him to reduce his use of quotations from the Bible because his campaign speeches sounded too much like religious missionary assemblies, he got angry, saying, "Don't underestimate the American people." What he expected out of the American people was a revival of faith that required religious and spiritual values. The founding fathers of America relied on their belief in the God of Jesus Christ in order to give significance to their revolutionary undertakings. They inscribed this faith in the founding documents of their nation, "In God We Trust," and bravely set the basic tone of their system of government. Thus, where they revered God, there was liberty. I was convinced that Eisenhower, who shared such a faith, visibly proved his religious faith in front of the American people by daring to receive baptism. Before coming to Washington, Sachs made a request to the President for an interview with me. As far as I was concerned, I wanted to see President Eisenhower, but there was no specific reason to see him. But Sachs's intention was to take advantage of a meeting as a photo opportunity of me shaking hands with Eisenhower for publicity for the Sky Pilots. We were staying in a hotel called the Fairfax Hotel, and there was a call from a White House secretary. "Captain Fuchida, what is the reason you want to see the President?" It was a natural question, but I was puzzled. If Sachs had been there, he would have managed an appropriate response. I did not have time to think and told him about Sachs's true intention. "We have no particular reason. We just want to take a photo shaking hands with the President." As I was afraid that he might take my answer as a ridiculous request, the secretary laughed. "Captain, as a matter of fact, people with similar requests visit the White House every day, and the President is happy to satisfy their needs by coming out to the veranda when he has time. The gate of the White House is open from 9 o'clock in the morning until 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and you will be given the opportunity if you wait on the veranda." After saying, "Thank you," I hung up the telephone. But I thought, why should I waste my time to wait around for the President to appear? I did not care about the photo, and I did not say anything about this conversation to Sachs. On Friday, there was another call from the secretary. Again, Sachs was not around. The secretary asked me, "Captain, do you play golf?" I bluntly responded that I could not. "Then it doesn't matter. To tell you the truth, the President will be playing golf, and we wanted to invite you to join." That night, there was a long envelope delivered to me at the Fairfax Hotel from the White House. It contained a charcoal sketch of Eisenhower swinging his golf club. On the sketch was the President's signature, D. White Eisenhower, and in the right upper corner, "To Captain Fuchida." There was no other explanation, but I had read the article, accompanied with a photo of the President, in the evening paper that said that Eisenhower played golf that day, and that an artist drew a portrait of him swinging his golf club. I thought that what I received must be a preliminary sketch. He must have had one of the sketches sent to me with his signature. I was deeply moved that he paid such attention to me, and I felt the greatness of his personality. Then there was another call from the White House secretary. This time Sachs answered the phone, and the secretary asked if I had received the preliminary charcoal sketch. I told Sachs to respond that I certainly had received it. The secretary suggested that the President would attend service at the National Presbyterian Church in Washington, D.C., and if the captain wanted to attend the same service, he was more than welcome. Sachs was delighted and accepted without asking me. For him, it was an opportunity to have my photo taken shaking hands with the President. The following day, Sunday, February 22nd, Sachs and I went to the National Presbyterian Church early, well ahead of time. While we were waiting, we talked to the minister about our situation, and he asked if I could give my testimony at an assembly that night. As we were available, Sachs, without hesitation, accepted the offer on the spot. At the scheduled time for the start of the service, as the organ began its prelude, about 500 attendees rose from their seats to receive the President. Eisenhower entered the hall, escorted by his Secret Service guards. He noticed me standing near the entrance, and he shook hands with me lightly. With a wink, he signalled for me to follow him. He sat in the seat at the centre of the hall and let me sit next to him, as the First Lady did not accompany him that day. After we sat down, the congregation sang a hymn. It was my favourite hymn, Blessed Assurance, and I sang with a loud voice, "This is my story, this is my song." Then, the president at my side also sang with a loud voice. He had commanded all the military forces of the Allies, so his voice was powerful. After prayer, the sermon and offering, it was time for reporting. The minister asked me to stand up as a new guest. He introduced me as the former commander of the Pearl Harbor attack, but now a member of the family of God. This was greeted with thunderous applause, including the president next to me. Then the minister announced that the captain would give a testimony at a missionary assembly that night, and that everyone in the audience was invited to attend. This again received a big hand. After a prayer session of approximately 30 minutes, the minister closed with a benediction, and amidst a chorus of amens by the choir and ringing chimes, the president shook hands with me before he left. The entire audience was standing as they saw him off. After all this, Sachs failed to take a picture, but I admired the warm-hearted Eisenhower. I thought, what a man of God he is. As I was in Washington, D.C., I made a courtesy visit to the Japanese embassy to see Ambassador Eikichi Araki. Ambassador Araki was unmarried, and he looked like a saint with a mature and vice-free appearance. When I greeted him and told him my impression of the tours in the United States, he praised me a lot, causing me to feel embarrassed. "You are doing a very good thing. You are enhancing a friendly atmosphere between Japan and the United States through private diplomacy. If we ambassadors should spend 10 years doing what we do, we still would not be able to match you." I admit it's true that an affinity towards Japan prevails nowadays, but it is not specifically with Japan that they maintain friendly terms. They are friendly to any country in the free world. Anyway, this country knows, as you have seen, to revere God. Japan used to declare respect for the heavens, but it did not become part of our nature. We continued to deal only with persons, and our nation collapsed. On the day after my visit to the Japanese embassy, I went to see Vice President Richard M. Nixon on Capitol Hill. Nixon had been a Navy lieutenant commander during the war, and my counterpart fighting in the South Pacific. As we shook hands, Nixon told me, "We fought to our very limit in the war. That is why we can be good friends just by shaking hands." Then he introduced me to people at the Pentagon. At the Pentagon, I delivered a speech in a separate building called the Naval Annex, followed by a service in a chapel at the Pentagon. After the service, the chief chaplain of the Department of the Navy asked me to go to the Naval Academy in Annapolis. As I had wanted to visit the Naval Academy, I accepted the chance invitation with delight. I was taken to Annapolis by car, and my host was the chief chaplain, Lieutenant Commander John Craven. As we arrived just before lunchtime, I was ushered first to the students' dining room. The officer on duty, a lieutenant, introduced me to the students. "We have a guest today. I would like to introduce Captain Fuchida of the former Imperial Japanese Navy. This is the person who was the lead commander of the Pearl Harbor bombardment." His introduction was followed by a big applause from approximately 3,000 students. When the officer said, "In honor of Captain Fuchida, we serve you today Japanese food," there was again thunderous applause. Then the officer on duty gave an order, "Seat." Up to this point it was the same at the Etajima Naval Academy. A bugle call signalled a meal, students ran into the dining room, but they stood at the table waiting for the order, "Seat," from the officer on duty. At the order, they all sat at their table and started to eat together voraciously. But it was different at Annapolis. Those who sat on the order, "Seat," were only third-year senior students. The first- and second-year junior students were still standing. As I watched in wonder, the senior students who were the leaders at each table gave the next order, "Seat," and all the junior students sat down. I understood then that the educational discipline of junior students by senior students was far more complete than it ever was at Etajima. While the Japanese Naval Academy also placed importance on educational discipline to junior students by their seniors, when it went too far, it often resulted in punishment with a punch. It was quite common, but before I joined the Naval Academy, Vice Admiral Kantaro Suzuki, who was the school's superintendent until the year before I entered, had prohibited such punishment. This rule was strictly enforced, and any student who violated the rule was dismissed from the academy. Thanks to him, I was never hit by senior students during my stay at the school, and I never hit junior students. However, the other disciplinary practices were quite strict. I entered the school in late August, in the heat of summer. As it was hot, I was cooling off after dinner at the beach near the parade ground. I had my hands raised to my waist. Just then, a senior student approached from behind in silence and, without warning, hit both of my hands very hard. As I lowered my hands in surprise, he left, scowling at me. I learned later that first-year students were always supposed to keep their hands low at etajima. It was when they became second-year students that they were allowed to raise their hands. Then, when you became a third-year student, you could cross your arms at your chest. It was such a cumbersome disciplinary system. Post-war comments from the media bitterly criticized the system, saying that because regular officers had been disciplined by such rigid educational practices, they became undesirable persons who should be expelled by General MacArthur. However, back in MacArthur's country, the military academies were giving much stricter educational discipline, limiting the freedom of students. Otherwise, soldiers with a strong backbone could not be developed. There was one difference from etajima. The first thing you see as you pass through the gate of Annapolis is a big chapel. I asked the chaplain who accompanied me, "Do students regularly attend the prayer service on Sundays?" The chaplain responded, "Most of them do, but they can also leave before the prayer, but usually those students who go out attend morning prayer in some church in the town." I could sense that students at Annapolis were brought up to live in awe of God. Meanwhile, at etajima, they were brought up learning to confront other men with a sort of animosity. Now Japan has emerged from the ashes. What should we do for the reconstruction of our mother country? First of all, live in awe of our God, and believe in Jesus Christ, who was sent to us by God. Back in Berkeley, California, I performed a service at a Methodist church for Japanese in that city. After the assembly, I was having a chat with the minister, Masahiro Omi. He asked me if I was interested in visiting Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz, former Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, who happened to live in Berkeley. It had been a while since I saw Nimitz, and I wanted to know how he was. I asked Reverend Omi to give a call to the Admiral to ask when it would be convenient to meet, and the answer was that he was more than pleased to see me. The next morning, Omi drove me in his car. Admiral Nimitz's residence was halfway up a hill behind Berkeley, and as we drove up the winding road, we saw an old man holding his hands together and watching the cars as they passed by. It was like a father waiting impatiently outside the gate for his son, who was returning home from his study away. After we approached the house and parked the car, Nimitz opened our car door and invited me into his house, telling me, "Welcome, Captain." As he ushered us into the living room, Nimitz pulled the sofa to the centre of the room and told us that from there we would have the best view. From where I was sitting, there was certainly a fantastic view with the Golden Gate Bridge framed by the glass window. After serving us tea, Nimitz wanted to show us his bonsai miniature trees that he was taking care of. He was very proud of them. In the garden, we saw plenty of bonsai pines, lined up throughout the garden, from Takamatsu on Shikoku Island. After that, Mrs. Nimitz wanted us to see her oil paintings, sketched while she and her husband were stationed in Japan. They were hanging in each room, and they were all beautiful paintings of Japanese sights. As we talked frankly, I found out that Nimitz was a Protestant and that Mrs. Nimitz was a Unitarian. Usually, faith in the Christian God is based on the Holy Trinity of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Unitarians believe in the Father and the Son, separating the Holy Spirit, and they said their daughter was a Catholic. With a smile, I told him, "Then your family can be regarded as ecumenical." To my statement, he muttered, "I don't care if we are ecumenical or not. My headache is that my daughter wants to devote her life as a Catholic nun." Thus, when we started to talk about faith, he told me the following story. When the war ended and he returned from Japan, the Admiral retired as Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet. The U.S. Congress then honored him with the title of Permanent Fleet Admiral. Following that, based on many requests, he conducted lecture tours all across the US. One day, when he arrived at a university in the East to give a lecture, he saw a small church bell hanging in the corridor. As he approached, he found Japanese letters inscribed on the bell. He asked about the bell and learned that a student who had been a GI brought it back from Japan as a souvenir. The Admiral got very angry about this. "What a disgrace that a Christian from the States has brought back a church bell from a Christian church in Japan." Then it was agreed that the bell would be returned to the church in Japan where it came from. General Headquarters of the Occupation Forces in Tokyo was able to identify the church based on the name inscribed on the bell. It was safely returned to a tiny church in the suburbs of Fukuoka City, on the coast of Kyushu Island. Then, some time later, Admiral Nimitz received letters of appreciation from children who attended that church. He treasured the letters which he showed me. They were written with childlike letters and sentences. According to the letters, children belonging to the church wanted to have a bell, as they had heard many stories about the significance of a bell. There was a blacksmith in the village who told them to pick up junk metal of copper or brass, then he could make one for them. Every day they went to all the nearby fire-bombed ruins to pick up scrap metal, and when they had collected enough, the blacksmith eventually made the scrap into a bell. They were all happy and proud of the bell. But one day, soldiers from the occupation forces came to the beach for some leisure time and took a rest at the church. One of them found the bell, and listening to the proud children with their mixed smattering of English and Japanese, learned that it was made of scrap metal from incendiary bombs dropped on Fukuoka City. The soldier took the bell by force, telling them that it belonged to the US. Now that the bell had been returned, thanks to Admiral Nimitz, they were very happy, writing in their letters, "Thank you, Mr. Nimitz." As I laughed at the end of his story, he seemed to be a bit startled. He said that with regards to souvenirs, he himself had a souvenir, and he was aware of its significance because when he received it, the souvenir's background was explained by a Japanese interpreter. Nimitz was presented a military sword belonging to Admiral Suemu Toyoda, former Commander-in-Chief of Naval Headquarters, as well as the combined fleet. Now he was telling me that he would like to return the sword to Admiral Toyoda because it was not something he ought to own personally. Then he asked me to take it back with me when I returned to Japan. I was going to remain in the US for another 2 months, so I asked the Japanese embassy to take care of the sword's return. The sword should have been returned to Admiral Toyoda without fail. In this manner, Fleet Admiral Nimitz showed that he was also a person who revered God. While I was staying in Berkeley, I paid a visit one day to Admiral Raymond Spruance in Monterey, a beach area on the central coast of California. Spruance was the well-known Commander-in-Chief of the Fifth Fleet of the U.S. Task Force, and he was the general commander of the enemy at the Battle of Midway. For this reason, I asked him to write the preface for the English version of my book titled Midway, which was published by the Naval Institute in Annapolis. As a token of my appreciation, I presented him my family treasure, 2 masks of the traditional No theatre. He was very pleased and gave me a courteous letter expressing his appreciation, but I had never had a chance to see him until this visit to his home. Admiral Spruance lived at a country club in an area that juts out to the Pacific Ocean like a fist. The place, near the city of Monterey, is called Pacific Grove, since the place had a mild climate all year round and spectacular scenic beauty. Many admirals of the U.S. Navy had their second homes there. As I entered Spruance's house, I could see the 2 No masks which I gave to him. They were hanging on the hallway wall leading from the entrance to the 2nd floor. Mrs. Spruance thanked me as she pointed to the masks. From the living room, I saw an old pine tree with a thick trunk extending in the garden like a dragon. As I was watching the fine tree, Spruance told me that the old pine tree was a constant source of trouble with his wife. While Mrs. Spruance wanted to cut down what she called an obstacle, Spruance himself wanted to keep it. Then he turned to me and asked me what he should do. By nature, I did not like to cut live trees, and I responded that it would be better not to cut it. Spruance was very content, as this was the exact answer he wanted, but Mrs. Spruance was rather sulky. Around lunchtime, we went to the country club's dining room, where Richmond Turner, former Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Navy's 7th Fleet, and his wife joined us. There I enjoyed the friendly hospitality of worthy rivals during the Pacific War, just like the saying, "Yesterday's enemy is today's friend." In recent years, the Japanese government has sponsored a national memorial service for the war dead of the Pacific War on August 15th, the anniversary of the end of the war. The Emperor and Empress attend the service, and the Prime Minister delivers a memorial address. If the Prime Minister reads, "Dying for a great undertaking, impertinent members of the National Christian Council of Japan and others will demonstrate and agitate by passing out handbills that angrily state that war can never be a great undertaking." Certainly war itself may not constitute a great undertaking, but once a state enters into a war, the nation will engage the entire country, staking the lives of her soldiers. This itself is a great undertaking, and if the combatants should fall in the battlefields, how can you express it with words other than making the ultimate sacrifice for a great cause? While I was staying in Honolulu, I happened to witness a memorial parade for the war dead of the 442nd Infantry Regimental Combat Team. The 442nd Combat Team was a troop comprised of second-generation Japanese Americans, Nisei, who were born as American citizens, and the unit was organized by those who volunteered in the face of the emergency of their homeland, the United States. Following the outbreak of war between the US and Japan, many Japanese living in Hawaii and all on the West Coast, approximately 110,000 in total, including many second-generation Japanese Americans, were interned in camps in the interior of the continental US. Anger among the interned American citizens went unheeded as they were cursed by the violent words of the head of the U.S. Army's Western Command, Lieutenant General John L. DeWitt. "A Jap's a Jap." Initially, those interned Nisei were not allowed to enlist, but as the war became fiercer, they were accepted as volunteers to fight for their home country, the United States. While the regimental commander and his battalion leaders were whites, the troops reporting to them were Nisei, mostly from Hawaii. It appears true that there were mixed feelings among the first-generation Japanese regarding the Nisei's participation in the war, and because of their ethnic features, the U.S. military authorities deployed them on European fronts instead of in the Pacific Theatre. Before long, the 442nd Combat Team fought bravely and fiercely, in particular on the Italian front. They succeeded in rescuing a U.S. Army unit that was surrounded by the German army and on the brink of annihilation, but they paid a high price and made significant sacrifices. The loyalty of the Nisei troops who shed their blood for their home country, the U.S., moved all American people profoundly. I saw news photos of the 442nd Combat Team as they arrived by ship in New York after the end of the war. They were given an incredibly enthusiastic welcome. Now in Honolulu, at the center of the parade, there were many open cars with families of the war dead. They were all elderly first-generation Japanese couples, but the crowds gathered on both sides of the road were giving enthusiastic cheers to show respect and affection as the cars passed by. Also, confetti was thrown from buildings on both sides of the road onto the cars, a gesture of appreciation from the American people to those parents whose sons made the ultimate sacrifice for a great cause. Watching the parade, I made up my mind to pay a visit to the burial places of my former men who fell during the Pearl Harbor attack, also participants in a great undertaking. On the day of the Pearl Harbor attack, 29 planes were lost, and 55 crewmen never returned. As is usually the case for air combat, the details of what happened to each plane were not or would never be known. At a minimum, I wanted to visit the burial places of those who crashed on Oahu Island, but I had no information as to where they might be. I asked older generation Japanese in the area, but they said they did not know. At that time, Hawaii had not attained statehood yet, so I visited the Territorial Government Office of Hawaii in Honolulu in order to investigate any existing files. In the public relations section of the Territorial Office, there were no records related to the burial places, but I learned that there was a request from the Japanese government to transport the remains of the war dead to the homeland for proper burial. This request was passed through the U.S. State Department, which was investigating the matter. I did not make much headway there. Then, as they say, nothing ventured, nothing gained. I thought of visiting the headquarters of the Pacific Fleet. However, if I did it theatrically, it would go against the advice from my many friends. Refrain from any visible behavior, except for missionary work, that would stir up memories of the Pearl Harbor incident. So I visited the headquarters of the Pacific Fleet by myself without informing the press beforehand, and talked to the Pacific Fleet about this matter. Then, contrary to my expectation, the headquarters staff was very much in favour of the idea, and they said a lieutenant from the Public Relations Department would be assigned to assist me. Under the lieutenant's guidance, I first went to the Naval Cemetery at Nuuanu, just outside Honolulu. According to the lieutenant's explanation, Lieutenant Fuchida Iida was buried there, and he indicated the burial spot. Lieutenant Ida was the commander of the Soryu fighter squadron, and his plane was hit and caught fire while attacking the seaplane base at Kaneohe. Engulfed by fierce flames and holding the control lever resolutely like a god of fire, he gave a farewell salute with his free hand. Then he made a sharp turn towards the big hangar at Kaneohe base. His plane crashed into the hangar and exploded, engulfing the hangar, and the big seaplanes housed within in flames. According to the lieutenant, the U.S. Navy admired this heroic behavior of the enemy pilot, and they covered the pilot's coffin with their naval ensign and, with full military courtesy, buried Ida while a guard corps performed a funeral gun salute. Snapshot photos of those events were sent to Ida's surviving family members. This happened such a long time ago, but I was deeply moved and admired his great deed. In front of Lieutenant Ida's grave, I prayed for the repose of his soul. Besides Ida, 3 crew members of Lieutenant Mimori Suzuki's plane were buried in the Nuuanu Naval Cemetery. Lieutenant Nyoji Iwasa of the Special Mini-Submarine Unit was also buried there. According to the lieutenant, it was not confirmed that it was Iwasa, but the collar badge that was recovered was of the rank of lieutenant. Since Iwasa was the only lieutenant among the crews of the Special Mini-Submarines, there could be no mistake. My guide said that the badge was sent to family survivors back in Japan. The lieutenant then took me from Nuuanu Cemetery to Wahiawa. Wahiawa, which is located in the center of Oahu Island, is surrounded by pineapple fields. There, 4 bodies were buried. A space of 1 tsubo, approximately 10 square feet, was surrounded by a bamboo fence, and on top of the grave mound a cross was erected. On the crossbar there was an inscription that read, 4 Japanese Air Force died in action, Deck 7, 1941. I nodded that they were crew members of 2 dive bombers. The lieutenant who was escorting me telephoned Clarence Caminos, head of the Wahiawa police station, who explained the following to me. The bodies of those 4 crew members whose planes were shot down were beyond recognition. One of the planes crashed into a house around 8 o'clock in the morning, and the other one crashed in a pineapple field 4 miles away, still carrying a 500-pound bomb. The 4 dead bodies were lying in state at the Wahiawa fire station that night, and they were buried here the next day. The funeral service was conducted by the army, but the pilots were treated with the courtesy given to combatants killed in war. Thus, the war dead, those who fell doing great deeds, were treated courteously regardless of whether or not they were the enemy. Thanks to the favourable cooperation of the headquarters of the Pacific Fleet, I was able to visit 2 burial places on Oahu Island. They said there were no more. I left Honolulu and I was on Kauai Island on July 17th, Friday. On the following day, an express letter was delivered to me in the afternoon. Based on the writing, the letter was from a first-generation Japanese, but the sender remained anonymous, only stating, "Honolulu sure to win member." It was dated July 17th and written clumsily as follows. Dear Sir, salute to Captain Fuchida. Performance of Japanese air squadrons was excellent. Once the Pacific Fleet was annihilated. Thanks to your efforts. 2 or 3 planes of your men were shot down. 1 plane made a crash landing on Niihau Island due to fuel shortage. 1 petty officer was dead in Niihau Island. I want you to go to Niihau Island to visit his grave. All other people made a triumphant return in silence. Please bring back the soil or something to Japanese people visiting the grave. Japanese people will be pleased as well as the petty officer. Please make sure to go to Niihau Island to visit the grave. It is your great responsibility as the commander. Be sure to go to visit the grave. To Captain Fuchida. July 17th, joining my hands in prayer. Honolulu Sure to Win member. What he refers to as Niihau Island is actually Niihau Island near Kauai Island. It is the second smallest island among the 8 Hawaiian islands. However, I had a connection with this Niihau Island. When we were planning the Pearl Harbor air raid, I thought that we needed a rescue plan for the crews of those planes which were hit during the attack and unable to make it back to their motherships. The core of air power is the air crews, and training them cannot be accomplished in a day. It requires 1,000 hours of flight experience for an aviation trainee to become a qualified flyer, and that can easily take 3 full years. We could not afford to and should not lose such capable air crews due to combat damage or fuel shortage, especially during the war. As I investigated the information available at General Headquarters, I found that the west beach of Niihau Island was flat. That would allow small planes to crash land. In addition, the sea immediately around the beach was deep, offering suitable conditions for our submarines to hide and wait. Additionally, Niihau Island was reported to be pasture land used for grazing cattle, and there were no white people, only 3 Japanese caretakers and approximately 20 native Hawaiian workers. I thought that this was an ideal site to accommodate damaged planes. Then, after consultation with Chief of Staff Gender, I asked him to propose to the Combined Fleet's Command Center that we assign a submarine to hide underwater near the west beach of Niihau Island on the day of the air raid. The submarine would arrange to pick up the downed crews at night. The Command Center agreed and issued an order to the 6th Fleet that was the advance troop. Accordingly, the 6th Fleet dispatched a submarine belonging to the 3rd Submarine Troop to Niihau Island on the day of the air attack on Pearl Harbor. Submarine I-74 was assigned for this duty, and she was hiding in the sea area off the west beach of Niihau Island, in the event it became necessary to rescue the crews of any crashed planes. However, the commander of the advance troop ordered all submarines under his control to change the assault formation at 1 p.m. and have them concentrate at the mouth of Pearl Harbor in order to attack any ships escaping from or coming into the harbor during the air raid. Therefore, based on the order, submarine I-74 also left the deployment area near the coast of Niihau Island around 3 p.m. Given the circumstances, I myself was not aware of the existence of any crashed plane on Niihau Island during or after the war. Suddenly I learned about its existence from the letter from a Sure to Win member in Honolulu. I was shocked, and I was moved by the sincerity of this letter, and as I happened to be on nearby Kauai Island, I decided to visit Niihau Island. But the next day, July 19th, was Sunday, and I was scheduled to have 3 assemblies, in the morning, afternoon, and at night, so I decided to visit Niihau on the 20th. I was lodging at Masaki's of Waimea and consulted with the owner, Mrs. Nobuko Masaki. According to Nobuko, the entire island of Niihau belonged to the Robinson family, and they were grazing cattle and breeding turkeys. Therefore, there was nobody living on that island except for workers, and there was no public transportation. She said I could go there by chartering a fishing boat, but it required permission from the Robinson family to land on the island. Next, I visited the Robinson family in Lihue, the main city on Kauai, to explain the situation. The head of the household, Aylmer Robinson, was very understanding and offered me a ride on an empty barge that would be leaving in the morning on the 20th, if I did not mind sharing the ride with cows on the way back. That was very convenient for me, so we went to Niihau Island on that morning in the Robinson family barge. In this manner, I came to know what actually happened in what is called the Niihau Island incident. The story was as follows. It was shortly before noon on December 7th, 1941, when a single-seat small plane crashed on the west beach of Niihau Island. It was close to a camp where approximately 20 Kanakas, or native workers of Polynesian descent, lived. Those natives, who were off work because it was a Sunday, came out in quick succession and with a great deal of curiosity to see the crashed plane. On the plane there were marks of the rising sun on the wings and the fuselage, and there were scars of bullet holes all over. In the cockpit, a half-unconscious pilot sat limply. The natives opened the windshield to rescue him and took him to the camp to look after him. There they took care of him, giving him food and drink, but none of them was aware of the Pearl Harbor air raid at that time. Before long, one of the natives gave a call to Yoshio Harada, who was a Nisei and manager of the Robinson family estate and caretaker of Niihau Island. He came promptly. At the time this occurred, Harada lived in a resort villa of the Robinson family, almost 2 miles away from the workers' camp. Harada took the Japanese pilot to the villa where he lived. His wife, Irene, was also a Nisei. She sometimes went by her Japanese name and had 3 small children, but she took utmost care of this Japanese pilot. The Japanese pilot was named Shigenori Nishikaichi, and he was 23 years old. He was a first air petty officer of the Japanese Navy and from the crew of the Hiryu. His plane was hit and damaged while strafing Bellows Air Base. Because he did not have enough remaining fuel, he knew he could not make it back to the mothership, so he made a crash landing on the West Beach at Niihau Island, according to our battle plans, in the event a plane was damaged. Petty Officer Nishikaichi explained what had happened to Harada, who was extremely excited by the story and swore that he would protect him even if the price were his own life. Nishikaichi told Harada that a boat from a submarine would be coming that night to rescue him, so both of them waited all night alongside the crashed Zero fighter. They waited in vain until dawn, but the boat from the submarine never came. They stood waiting the next night as well, but again it was in vain. On the 9th, word of the Pearl Harbor attack reached Niihau Island, and the local workers were very upset. There was even a rumor that the U.S. Coast Guard from Lihue, Kauai, was coming to take the Japanese pilot. However, Nishikaichi told Harada that he could not afford to suffer the disgrace of imprisonment as a Japanese soldier, and that he was ready to kill himself before he was arrested. However, he had a huge concern. His gear sack had been taken away by the workers to their camp. He said that it contained a communication code table for the fighters who attacked Pearl Harbor, and if it was seized by the enemy, vital secrets of the Japanese Air Force would be revealed. By all means, Nishikaichi said, he must take the code back and burn it before he dies. Harada soon went to the workers' camp, trying to retrieve the sack, but the workers had by now regarded the injured pilot as the enemy and refused to comply. Harada returned to the villa empty-handed. He then suggested to Nishikaichi that they set the camp on fire and burn the sack with the code table at the same time. It is said that Nishikaichi smiled for the first time since his crash landing. Thus, in the early dawn on December 12th, the two put their plan into action. The shabby planked camp soon became a sheet of fire. As they did not want to cause injuries or deaths, they tried to warn the local workers to take refuge and cried, "Fire! Fire!" But the workers, who jumped out of the camp in a panic, were extremely furious when they learned that the fire was started by Harada and the pilot. They then tried to attack them. The two men ran, and when they reached the mountains, they hugged each other and committed suicide with their pistols. It was reported that those local workers who chased after them received a reward from the U.S. military authorities, based on the finding that the workers killed Harada and Nishikaichi, pelting them with stones as the two enemy fugitives were resisting capture and brandishing pistols. This, then, was the Niihau Island incident. 12 years after these events, I stood at the same place on the west beach of Niihau Island and recollected those days. And I could not repress my tears, thinking how Petty Officer Nishikaichi must have felt, waiting patiently all night for the arrival of the boat from the submarine hiding in the waters near the beach. Later, I had heard that the spot where Nishikaichi and Harada committed suicide was their burial place, but it was not possible to confirm this. The U.S. Army had dug the soil all around the beach to create trenches after the attack. Later, together with the cows, I returned to Kauai Island on the Robinson family's barge and went straight to visit Yoshio Harada's widow, Irene, who lived in Kapaa. After she lost her husband, She was interned for 3 long years in a prison in Honolulu by the U.S. military authorities for treason for having protected the Japanese soldier. During that time, her children were taken care of at an orphanage in the town. When I visited Mrs. Harada, she was making her living by running the Irene dressmaking school. Her eldest daughter, Kikue, was 18 years old and was away studying at the University of Hawaii. Her other children, 17-year-old Zenichi and 15-year-old Yasuko, were with her at home. When her father, Yoshio, died, Yasuko was 3 years old and Harada was 39 years old, the same age as I was when the incident occurred. The war caused an incredible misfortune to the family, and I apologized to Irene from the bottom of my heart. However, she said, "I am puzzled that you apologize so much. There is nothing wrong for the U.S. military authority to have convicted me for treason, as I am an American citizen born in the United States. However, under our skin, the blood that flows is Japanese. Therefore, I do not think that my husband did anything wrong." I could not help but feel true respect for what she said. Then, after a brief pause, she said that war was terrible. Knowing that I was on Kauai Island for Christian missionary work, she said that she was very pleased and that she would definitely attend the assembly at Kapaa Christian Church that night. Thus, by July 20th, Monday, I completed my missionary work on Kauai Island and continued to have assemblies on Hawaii Island on the 21st and 22nd, on Maui Island on the 23rd, and on Molokai Island on the 24th. As I felt somewhat tired, I took time off to rest in the remaining days in Kona on Hawaii Island. I headed for home on August 17th, Monday, leaving from Honolulu on board the President Wilson. I arrived at Yokohama Port on August 21st, Friday, and my tour in the United States that extended for 10 months was finally over. In early June 1968, I was asked to do missionary work in Wakayama, which is located in the Kansai region of Honshu, and famous for its mikan, mandarin oranges. I was 65 years old then, and Mr. Tadao Nakajima of the Wakayama Church wrote an article in the July edition of the Christ Taishu Shimbun, Christ Public Journal, regarding the progress of my missionary work as follows. The Reverend Fuchida has been used for missionary work to spread the gospel in many places of the world, and he has achieved what will be remembered as major accomplishments in the history of missionary work throughout the world. However, I am afraid that he might have exhausted himself by forcing himself beyond his physical endurance for his age. Twice he had to sit down and rest while walking up the steps leading to the observation platform overlooking Wakanura, the scenic area outside Wakayama City. It appeared to me that both his physique and heart were weakened more than mine, and I will never be like an ordinary person again after my long struggle against disease. However, his spirits still soared to the heavens, and he said that from June 15th his schedule was filled with visits to Okinawa and then on to Taiwan over the next 2 months. I fear that during his missionary tour, someday and somewhere, Reverend Fuchida might collapse. For me, I am reminded of the conversion of the Apostle Paul and his subsequent mission of explosive passion, just like the vision that now enfolds the Reverend Fuchida. I can only pray that some time of physical relief should be given to him. My wife was touched by this article. Mr. Nakajima was the only person to tell the truth, and she clipped the article and sent it to me, adding that I should take good care of myself. However, I was already in Taiwan, and taking care of myself was not the issue. It was quite tough for me with church assemblies scheduled for 40 consecutive days and held in places of blazing summer heat from late June to early August. Still, the assemblies were packed full every day with enthusiastic audiences. The faith of a Christian soldier led me to go wherever Christ dictated that I should go. After I returned from Taiwan, I attended a conference in September in Tokyo to await the Advent, and even extended my trip to Saitama Prefecture, near the capital city. In October, I did missionary work in Tokushima on Shikoku Island for 10 days. After I returned from Tokushima, I performed special missionary work for the Sakai Church for 3 days from October 11th. Returning home on the 14th, I was in bed all day feeling somewhat fatigued. The next morning, I stayed in bed until late in the morning. I got up around 10 a.m. and went to the backyard to see small white, red, and yellow chrysanthemums that were in full bloom. Because I had been away and was not able to take care of the garden, the flowers were hidden by weeds, undermining their beauty. Then, as I squatted down to pull out the weeds, I started to feel a dull pain around my stomach. Before long, I felt like I was suffocating. My stomach was upset, and I vomited. I wondered if I had eaten something bad, but the breakfast I had just finished was oatmeal, a fried egg, toast and coffee, my usual morning meal. Then I tried to extend my back and took a deep breath, but the ache only became more intense, and this made me feel very uncomfortable. I stopped my gardening work and sat down for a while, but my condition remained unchanged. I went back to the house and went to bed. I felt very uneasy, so I asked my wife to call a doctor in town who lived nearby. He had been her doctor for 10 years, and he was soon at our house to take an electrocardiogram, which indicated that I was probably suffering a heart attack. This time the doctor himself got rattled. He called a nearby university hospital to admit me for hospitalization. However, all the sick rooms were full with no likelihood of an available bed for a week or so. Then the doctor took my blood sample, injected me with some medicine, and, as he was leaving, told me to call him immediately, even at night, if I should feel any pain again. After the doctor left, it seemed that my pain became more acute, but I was in a deep sleep, perspiring a great deal, probably due to the combined effect of the morphine and tranquilizer. But I was having a dream. Where my chest ached, someone's hand was extended and pulled out the weed growing around my heart. One by one, from left to right, it seemed that the hand pulled out more than a dozen weeds. Every time the weeds were pulled out, my pain gradually became milder, and it was finally gone when all the weeds were pulled out. The next morning, when I woke up, I remembered the dream so vividly that I told my wife about all the details. She said it was simply because I was overly concerned about the unfinished job of pulling out weeds around the chrysanthemums. But as far as I was concerned, I believed that it was the hand of Jesus Christ who took away the veins that were tangled around my heart. My wife's younger sister came to our house to find out what had happened, and I told her my story. She told me not to tell such a silly thing to others, as they might take me to be insane. This is to be expected from faithless people, but in my faith I am convinced that Jesus alleviated my pain. After lunch, the doctor came to check on me and asked about my symptoms. I did not tell him about the dream, but I told him the pain in my chest was completely gone. When I told him, however, that I felt extreme stiffness in both shoulders and arms, he said it was a symptom of myocardial infarction. He again took an electrocardiogram. He said that there was nothing wrong with his diagnosis, as the electrocardiogram clearly showed I had had a heart attack, but I was lucky that the range of readings was very narrow. He added that it was like fishing with a paper net to pick up a goldfish. I had to take absolute bed rest even though the injury was slight. There was a risk that a serious rupture could result from too much stress. He said that according to statistics, 30% of those who suffered from myocardial infarction died within a month, and more than half of those died suddenly within several hours after the attack, typically described as, "He was so healthy." Therefore, any second attack could be fatal, and rest and recuperation were absolutely essential. He added that the therapy should be 3. 3, meaning complete rest in bed was required during the first 3 weeks. Some quiet movements inside my room would be allowed during the next 3 weeks, and during the last 3-week period, I would be allowed to take some short walks in the garden. This meant that I could not make any strenuous movements at all for the next 9 weeks, or approximately 2 months. My wife was happy telling me that Jesus meant to force me to rest. There was a diet therapy requirement as well. It said, cut down the intake of animal fat, coffee and sugar to moderate amounts, and refrain from excess smoking. I used to be a heavy smoker before, but it was no longer a problem as I stopped smoking 10 years ago to avoid misguiding people who were trying to approach Jesus Christ. I was not eating sugar as well because I suffered from diabetes. However, what bothered me was cutting my intake of animal fat and coffee, as both were my most favourite food and drink. but the doctor said that excessive intake of animal fat would result in an increase in cholesterol deposits, which would lead to further hardening of the arteries, and too much coffee increases the amount of fat in the blood veins. The development of medical treatment in our modern civilization is also a blessing of God. Therefore, to follow a doctor's advice is to follow the will of God. I made the hard decision to cut beef, pork, chicken and coffee from my diet, and regretfully cancelled all reservations for evangelistic tours from mid-October to the end of March of the following year. They say a rumour spreads 1,000 miles. Within a few days, I got a call from Vice Admiral Ryunosuke Kusaka in Takarazuka. "Hello, Fuchida. I understand that you have myocardial infarction. Again, I am your senior. I have the disease as well. I was hospitalized for 40 days. It's not so serious now, but I still always carry nitroglycerin in my pocket. I advise you to relax and take your time for a year or so, and try to live longer by even 1 minute or 1 second. Kusaka was very senior to me. He was always above me as my direct senior officer. When I was a flight student at Kasumigaura, he was an instructor of military strategy. When I was a lieutenant commander and aviation leader of the Akagi, he was the captain of the Akagi, and when I was the lead commander of the air squadrons of the Pearl Harbor attack, he was a rear admiral and chief of staff of the Pearl Harbor Task Force Fleet. When I finally became a captain and head of the General Fleet's aviation staff, he was a vice admiral and the combined fleet's chief of staff. I can never be ahead of him. This time, once again, he got the disease before me. But why should he use nitroglycerin? My understanding of nitroglycerin is that it is an explosive material. It sounded unsafe that he was always carrying dynamite in his pocket. When the doctor came, I asked him about this, and he said it was a sublingual tablet of nitroglycerin, used as a painkiller when an attack occurred. He said that the fact Vice Admiral Kusaka used nitroglycerin suggested that his disease was angina. He added that my heart attack was caused by myocardial infarction, and nitroglycerin did not work. Then I asked him about the difference between angina and myocardial infarction. According to the doctor, the most frequent and risky of heart diseases is coronary sclerosis. Coronary arteries, he explained, are two veins to transport fresh blood to the heart, and they branch off minutely, leading to muscles of the heart. When fat is accumulated inside these coronary arteries, the blood vessels become narrow, causing hardening of the coronary arteries. Then the necessary blood supply is not sufficient, and the heart muscles therefore receive insufficient oxygen. This is angina. On the other hand, myocardial infarction is a symptom indicating that hardened coronary arteries might be clogged with formed blood clots. I nodded, but did not really understand. I asked one more thing. Which had the higher rate of sudden death? He replied, "If myocardial infarction were a yokozuna, sumo wrestling champion, angina would be an ozeki, second rank below yokozuna." I gloated at his comment. Finally, this time I excelled over Vice Admiral Kusaka. They say that the usual case with myocardial infarction is live or die. It probably equates to what the first-generation Japanese Americans called a heart attack, and what we used to call heart failure in Japan. I heard that once the attack occurs, sometimes you feel acute pain in the chest, painful enough to tumble about, wanting to be killed instead, and die in a few hours. Anyway, if you pass the age of 65 years, it is time for you to retire, and you cannot avoid the symptoms of aging. It is rather refreshing to know that my killer will be myocardial infarction. The last thing that I want in life is to live endlessly, paralyzed, with saliva dribbling from my mouth. Our life in this world was something given by the Lord. What is destined to decay cannot be succeeded by something which does not decay. Therefore, your life lived in the flesh will be taken up by the Lord sooner or later, but those who are with the Lord are guaranteed eternal life which will never decay. As Paul the Apostle said, "For me to live is to live with Jesus." My desire is to be always with Jesus after leaving this world. However, if living in the flesh a bit longer will result in fruitful accomplishments, then it will be even more necessary for me to stay in the flesh for as long as possible. Before, when I was a soldier, when it was absolutely necessary to overcome the fear of death, I engaged in various spiritual trainings to cultivate a state of mind where there was no distinction between life and death. Looking back, when I was passing through a barrage of enemy fire, I felt as if I had been nearing such a state of mind. But once the war ended, I found myself not much different from where I started. However, now, feeling my Lord Jesus Christ close to me, I certainly have achieved the state of mind where there is no distinction between living and dying. I do not think that dying is a big issue, but if the Lord ordered me to live, it would then be more necessary for me to live for the time being.